Hey game developers, Bilal from Zenfinity.net, and welcome back to the C# Fundamentals for Unity course. And in this one we are going to be talking about properties, but before I begin I want to direct you to the previous video which was on generics, so definitely check that out if you haven't. And with that said, we will talk about what properties are. And basically the point of a property is to allow us to define some sort of attribute that can be referred to or changed in some way that we specify that's more complex than just the regular assignment operator and whatever else that you do with a variable. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove what we have here in our previous code. And I'll create an attribute, and I'll also create a property. Okay, now if you're from Java or you have previous programming experience, I will say before I begin, a property is basically a substitute for getters and setters. So in Java you might want to make a getter that allows you to, it'll be a function rather than just literally grabbing some value, which allows us to do something special, like maybe perform some arithmetic or equation on it. And then there's also settings. So maybe if we set our health, we want to do something based off of that, right? So we might have a count for our health, and then setting our health might check if the player dies, or it might update a UI or something, for example. So with that said, I'll go ahead and continue. So I'm going to make a private static. Actually, I'll just make this an integer here. Okay, so I'll make a private integer. I don't know. Let's go with health. That works pretty well, right? And I'm going to go ahead and make a public. Let's say integer health, right? So we'll do that, and I will actually go ahead and make these static. Okay, so and of course I'm just making them static so that they can be referenced in the main function here. And so what we're going to do is make the basic getters and setters, right? So this is what this looks like instead of making two functions called get health and set health, right? We just use the get keyword and we say return health, right? So this is the standard way of kind of making a property return some variable that is always going to be less accessible than the property, not required by the compiler, but there's no reason for a properties getter that has the same, I guess, access level as the actual variable. Because if this is public, then now people can just ignore this property and use this. And you don't want this for two reasons. One, because if the getters and setters, if all they do is just assign and return the variable, then it's pointless because you have two ways of doing that now. But if your property does something that you should not be able to do, or that you should not be able to bypass. So if you need to use the property to do something to this variable because it has some side effect, for example, you do not want people to be able to change this variable at the same time, right? So something to keep in mind. For example, setting the health and then not letting the player die if the health is set, for example. Okay, so I'll also write our setter here. So we'll say health equals value. Okay, and so value is, you can probably guess what that means. It's the keyword inside of a setter that allows us to say, okay, so when we say health equals, something, 145 is now passed to the set function as this value, right? So that's how that works. Okay, so what if we want to do something different, right? So what if we set the health to something lower than 0 or to 0, and we want the player to die, right? So let's go ahead and see what that would look like, right? Right, okay, so we have our setter here, and we can, of course, space it out like a function. So we'll say if health is less than or equal to 0, let's say health is equal to 0, and then let's say it's called die, right? And so in die, what I'll do is write console.writeLine. What a tragedy. Right? Okay, so what if we set our let's first, just set our health to 50, right, normally, and then we can go ahead and write console.writeLine health, and with the capitalized health, because of course that will access this getter, which will return this. So ultimately, if we were to make this lowercase and return that, this is going to print the same thing, right? Okay, so now just before starting, let's go ahead and move our health equals value to before this print function, because we want to actually change the value before checking, because if this is 0 and we set this to 50, then the player will die, and that's not what we're looking for. So we should see when we set this to 50, it should just print 50, yeah. And now what if we set this to, I don't know, -10, right? So we're setting our health to -10, and we see, what a tragedy. Okay, and so our player has died because we set our health, but we also did a check for death here. So, of course, if we did this normally, just health, so this is the other attribute that just stores the health, then none of this logic will go through. All that will happen is that health will be stored as -10, and we will see -10. So that's one reason why you might not want a higher accessor or an accessor at the same level as the property, because we've just bypassed our death logic. Okay, so that's everything for setting, but what if we wanted some properties that just look fancy, but don't really, they don't actually store a variable or anything, right? So let's say, for example, 2 squared, right? So what I'm going to do is type public static int 2 squared. And we'll put a getter in here. Math.pow 2 and 2, right? Double int. Okay, so let's say double. Okay, boom. So now we're squaring 2. And now instead of printing what we were having previously, we just have a writeLine here that prints our property. And I just want to say, obviously this is not a method. Get is a method, but over here we just access the variable normally, and then that will call this get method that will return some double, right? So if we go ahead and print that, and we see 2 squared is 4. So yeah, these are kind of the 2 main reasons for using a property. Well, I guess, I don't know if I should say 2. I should say you obviously want getters and setters, but there's no reason to use it on a public property, or sorry, a public attribute. If you have a public, so for example, if this health is public, you don't use a property that does the same thing with getters and setters, but you might want to use a property that will have some side effect when you set or get something. And my other main reason is because I might want something fancy, like say, I believe Unity's magnitude is a property. I might be wrong about that, but that's one example of doing a vector calculation with a property. Okay, so that's it for this episode. Basically, properties make getters and setters less ugly. So if you want to check out the rest of these videos, go ahead and hit the playlist in the top right, and you can see all these. If this helped you out, hit like and hit subscribe to see the rest of them. And with that said, I will see you in the next one, and have an awesome day.